Now, one of the fascinating things is that these are different parts of the brain that are.
His Holiness is Richie trying to correlate that with the Abhidhamma taxonomy and trying to understand in functional terms.
전배 벽에 내버려 치우고 그 내버려 차로대 전부 저 아이는.
Yes. The nebis. Yes.
That
Because in Abhidhamma taxonomy we speak of mental factors in specific functional terms. So there is a mental factor which is often translated as attention, manaskara, and this is the factor that selects what you're going to focus on. Then there is a mental factor that is the ability to stay single-pointed. And then there is a mental factor whose function is to, in some sense, like executive control, so that you don't get distracted by some other stimulus. You maintain that focus.
So one of the things that's interesting from a neuroscientific perspective is that there are parts of the brain that are involved in these different attention functions that overlap with emotion. And that is not surprising because when we ask ourselves what information in our environment tends to capture our attention, it tends to be emotional information. For example, we show alerting responses to stimuli in our environment which are emotional. We don't show those responses to stimuli that are very neutral. And so it's not surprising that there is some overlap in the brain regions which are important for emotion and attention.
So these are the two sides of the brain, yeah?
No,
Same
sorry.
brain.
This is the outer surface
yes.
of the brain, and the
Interesting.
diagram on the right,
yes,
is
that's right.
inside.
Center,
Yes,
yes.
it's cut in the middle.
Right.
Yeah. Now, in the interest of time, I'll just give one example, and then this afternoon we'll have more time. So I'll give one example of how we can study the impact of contemplative training on networks important for attention, and this afternoon I'll talk more about emotion. This is the quote that Arthur put up the first day from William James about how the education of attention is so important. And William James said, his last line here, it's easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. I think if William James had contact with the Buddhist tradition, he would have seen immediately that the methods that are so rich in your tradition, Your Holiness, represent strategies for educating attention. So this is a little hard to see, but children who have attention deficit disorder, which about 15% of children in the West between the ages of 7 years old and 16 years old are said to be diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And many of those children are being given drugs to somehow help with this. We think that there may be other strategies for doing it. One of the things that kids with this disorder show is that they're very variable in how they pay attention. Sometimes they can pay attention, other times they're distracted. And so they're just very variable. And what this simply shows, it's a technical way of demonstrating that their attention is very, very variable. So we asked the question whether 3 months of vipassana practice can reduce this variability and thereby improve attention. And so this was a study where we tested participants who were going. This was a Theravadan retreat center that you've been to, Your Holiness, the Insight Meditation Center in Barre, Massachusetts. And we tested practitioners who were practicing in a 3-month retreat. And we tested them before and after the 3-month retreat. And if you look to the right, the practitioners are labeled in these columns on the right. The practitioners are on the left side of that figure that's circled. And the white bars are how they responded before the retreat. And the gray bars are how they responded after the retreat. And what's being displayed is their variability in attention. So improved performance here would be reduced variability, decreased variability.
내가 잘치 모르다.
Laret kanda the variability lab jugal te kap ka shell mik patte tu kap ka shell mik patte ma tu ndege.
Never change.
Da deep pa nyom.
Novices who just practice for 1 week, they're the same when they start out with as the practitioners, and they show no change after 3 months, no change whatsoever. Then we also measured the brain. And I should point out that this is work that was directed by my colleague Antoine Lutz in our laboratory, and you've met Antoine on several occasions. He was actually one of Francisco Varela's last students. And after Francisco passed, he came to our lab. And what we show here is there's a specific measure of brain activity that's very, very interesting. And the best way for me to describe this measure is by using a metaphor. The measure is called phase locking. And it's phase locking between the external stimulus and what's going on in the brain. What the participants are doing is they're asked to pay attention to sounds, which are presented in headphones. And we have sounds that are going along, and every now and then there are tones. Every now and then there's a tone of a different pitch. So it may be like this: boop, 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 beep. And the practitioners have to notice when the beep occurs, and it's going into each of the 2 ears, and they're instructed to press a button when the beep occurs only if it's in one ear and not the other. And when the beeps are going very, very quickly, it's actually a very demanding task. And what we can use this task to track what's going on in the brain. Now, this phase locking can be described in this way. If you have a lake which is very, very still, and you toss a stone into the lake, if you're on the other side of the lake, you would be able to see the ripples in this very still lake. If the lake is turbulent, if there's a lot of waves, if you toss the stone, you wouldn't be able to see because...
Yes.
So this is the same in the brain.
Beautiful metaphor.
Pardon?
Beautiful metaphor.
Oh, thank you. I learned my metaphors from Mathieu La, who is the master of metaphor. I take no credit. What we see in the brain is the same thing. And what we see in the brain is that over the course of 3 months, the practitioners show a stiller mind. And so they are able to show a synchrony between the occurrence of the beep and the measured response, particularly in the frontal part of the brain. And so this is the primary change that we're able to track. So there is much more to say. I've only gotten through about 25%, but we'll have much more time in the afternoon. I want to be sure to leave the same amount of time for my very dear colleague Tanya.
아주 밀 레벨 거리시 셔대서 컴퓨터가 레벨 떴다. 녀업샤.
So maybe the computer is rebelling because we have been extolling the virtues of human brain.
So 컴퓨터 브레인 녀어서.
So it's like the computer is bored, you know.
Huh? Oh, can you? It disappeared onto a second and invisible screen. It turned out that it was hiding in another part of the universe. So now we're going to be hearing from our distinguished colleague Tanja Singer, who comes to us from Germany and the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig.
So what I wanted to do, His Holiness, is a great honor to talk again. I will present some things you heard in Delhi, but with more time, and we can go more in discussion, I hope. So what I want to do is to complement the view of Vichy, but coming to the question of whether we can train compassion and empathy. So I think one monastic scholar asked in the first day whether we can also find brain correlates to something precious like compassion. And I hope I will show you that we can find correlates. The question about how they relate is another question. The hard question of consciousness, as you said. And we will have another meeting tomorrow about the question how experience and neural correlates hang together. What I also want to do is to tell you a story about how the working together of monastic monks, in that case my favorite guinea pig, Mathieu Ricard, helped us to understand our models better. So how we kind of combined first-person perspective and experience with our methods and how we developed a new way of thinking through the cooperation. So let me introduce first a model we developed as the basis for a one-year longitudinal mental training study. And we will start in 2 months, so I cannot give you any data from 1 year, but I will show you data of 1 week and several weeks. So as Vichy said, when we start doing mental training or plasticity research, we first have to define which cognitive processes we want to focus on. What do we want to cultivate and what do we want to train? And so cognitive psychology came up with a lot of different distinctions. So for example, here we will train the first 3 months attentional abilities, like Vichy was just telling, like just coming back to the present moment, bringing the mind back from the past or future to the moment here. And we also train interoceptive awareness. And interoceptive awareness is getting aware of signals from the body. Hot, cold, heartbeat, so on. And I'm not talking today about that, but each of these processes have particular circuitry in the brain. Each process can be distinguished in the underlying circuitry which subserve them in the brain. Now, we have 2 other modules of 3 months everyday training, which we call affective and perspective, which is more cognitive in nature. So in the affective, we train something like loving kindness, increasing thankfulness, feeling of warmth and concern and compassion. But also we learn what Vichy was saying, what do we do if we have anger and fear? You cannot go directly into compassion if you're full of stress and anger. So how do you solve this problem? And then in contrast to that, the perspective block is perhaps what in Buddhism is called view or wisdom. It's a bit like the 2 wings of compassion, I think. So it is more related to an understanding, a cognitive understanding, and what we call, for example, metacognition. So cognition would be memory, attention. Metacognition is to become aware of what your mind is doing. It's like one level above. And you also need this capacity to become aware of what you have for conception of self. Get aware of construction of self and how self operates. Okay, so now I want to show you why these distinctions. So that's a model now just to show how we think about studying plasticity. So what we usually do when we start such a training study is to measure, for example, also genetic information of the subjects and information about their upbringing, the mother, the parents, the children, because we want to see how differences in the genetic makeup, but also difference in how people have been raised, predict how they will learn, and whether different types of people will learn different methods more easy or more difficult. And I can come to that later. And then we assume that mental training changes the brain. This is the concept of brain plasticity. And that these changes help predict changes in experience, subjective experience. So we measure subjective experience, but also on another level, health. So we measure stress hormones, heart rate, immune system, and so on. And then the last level is behavior. Do people act differently? And so, as Richie showed you yesterday, we have a lot of different tasks which are designed to measure attention or prosocial behavior and so on. So that's the basic underlying model of this research. Okay, now why do we separate these two? Why do we make this distinction? Partly because a field which is called social neuroscience and which wants to understand how do we understand other people? How do I know what you feel or what you think if I'm not in you? How do the brain solve this problem? And over many years, there has been more and more insight that there are different routes to the understanding of other people. So either I can feel what you feel, and this is what we would call an emotional or affective route. And this is, for example, empathy and compassion belong to this affective route. They are phenomena which reside here. And then there is another way to understand other people through knowledge-based inference. So, for example, this would be, because I know that Buddhists have a view that consciousness exists also if the brain dies, you have different assumptions than Western scientists when they are materialists, and they think consciousness collapses when the brain dies. And this kind of inference is... That's an inference I do not because I can feel something, but because I know about Buddhist philosophy. And it's a cognitive inference. And you call that cognitive perspective taking. To some extent, I can go into your mind because I know about the world and about your thoughts and beliefs. But I don't feel, I'm not in an emotional resonance. And the empathy route, the definition of empathy, is that I can directly go into emotional affective resonance if you feel, for example, pain. I feel pain, like my own pain. So this is an affective resonance which is directly and feels like something, it's not cognitive. And then I will show you why it is very...
Confirming what you are suggesting, that because when you feel very strong compassion for someone, you actually have a much stronger empathetic connection with that person.
Okay. So we can discuss that, because we understood a lot about empathy, but not a lot about the construct of compassion. And we only through time and studying these phenomena. So in a way, the difference between empathy and compassion, and I will tell you how we got also to understand why it's very important to make a difference between these concepts, is that compassion is not necessarily only to feel the same thing than you feel. So if you are in pain, I'm in pain. If you enjoy, I'm in joy. This is empathy. We share the same state. But compassion is more, you can be in pain, but I can feel concern and a motivation to want to relieve your suffering without feeling the pain. This is possible. To have compassion, which is a warm feeling, is also an affective, motivational state, but doesn't have to share the pain. And when you look into the brain, and many studies have shown, if that empathy and compassion rely on different networks in the brain than this kind of more cognitive way of understanding the world. And the green pathways in the brain are showing the cognitive perspective taking, the understanding network. And they develop later in children. Whereas the pathways which have been referred to as emotion circuitry or limbic circuitry, which are orange, like the insula, they develop early. Children with 1.5 years have already empathy, very early, before their brain matures to be able to make cognitive inference. So we are connected in a way of affect earlier than we are connected in an understanding way to the other in childhood. Okay, so let me now focus on the research between empathy and compassion. Why do we do the difference? Why, is it important? So, when neuroscientists started to want to investigate such phenomena like empathy, they had the hypothesis that perhaps, how can I feel when you have pain, even though I don't feel it in my body? I don't have pain, so how do I know how you feel? So the hypothesis was that observing your pain activates neural network in my brain, which usually process my own pain if I really get pain. And through this activation of networks, which are first-person pain network, I can now understand, this is how it feels. I feel it in my body and in my brain, basically. My brain codes for it. And we have a lot of evidence, which is called the shared network empathy hypothesis, that observing other people's emotions activates the same neuronal circuitry which processes the very same emotion in myself. So now the problem with that is, if you suffer, then I suffer too. Is that helpful? Is that helpful for me being a good person, pro-social, helping the world? So, even though in the West people always say it's good to have a lot of empathy and it's something we have to train, we were not so sure. And when we met Mathieu Ricard the first time, we asked him to come into our lab. And you see here, these are monks in the lab, and on the right side, Mathieu Ricard, which coming out of a brain scanner after 1 hour of torture from us. Because we had access to a modern technology which gives you, it's called real-time fMRI. So while he is in the scanner, we can see, and we ask him to go into different states of consciousness. Compassion, sometimes imagine afflictive emotion. he was not good in imagining afflictive emotion, better in compassion. But we can see the brain activity while he is in the scanner doing all these different states. So we asked him to go in different states. And first, we asked him, can you go into different compassion-related states? So what he did is different ways, what he calls, but he will tell you more what he did from the inside. It's non-referential compassion or loving kindness. And what was stunning is that I thought that he is now empathizing with the suffering of someone. But the brain signal which came out was totally different. It didn't look like the hundreds of studies we had made with untrained brain. So when he came out, I asked him, what are you doing? Are you not suffering, not feeling the pain? Because the network is so different. You are activating a network we know is involved in positive emotion, warmth, and affiliation. And so Mathieu explained from his first-person perspective what he was feeling, and that it was a very strong motivation and warmth and concern, but not necessarily pain. So we forced him to do empathy for pain. We said, you go back, and now please just go in empathy and suffering with the other, and don't go in compassion. Stop and just imagine suffering on your body. And here we saw the signal. We saw the pain-related network lighting up now. So at least we said, okay, Mathieu has a normal brain. When he imagines suffering and really goes in empathy, he can show that. And this helped us developing a model where we differentiated between the capacity of empathy and compassion. And so our model would state that we all have empathy. We are born with the capacity to resonate with the suffering of others. However, if it's too strong, it can turn into personal egocentric distress. You know, it can lead to very negative emotion and stress and to overwhelm. So this is the pathway down there. And why is this important? Because in helping profession, a lot of people make suicide. Doctors, nurses, a lot of people which have to deal with everyday suffering end their lives because they cannot cope. They don't know how to cope. And the suggestion is that if you know how to turn empathy, resonance, into compassion, then you are safe. Because you know how to develop positive emotions of concern. It's about the other, not about me. And you develop pro-social motivation, a strong motivation to help. So, you know, it's nice to have one brain like Mathieu, but science doesn't believe in one brain. So to test this model, we started to do different training study. And this is just a 1 week. It's very short, but it's a beginning. And we trained one control group in memory. It's a mental training technique to improve memory. And the other group in loving kindness and compassion. So probably I don't have to explain people here what loving kindness is. But given we had a secular training, we said to the to the students, it were students, university students, which had never done any practice. We said, start with imagining, for example, the picture of your mother, or a dear friend, or a loved one, or your children. And just try to improve this. And after and then we scanned their brain before and after, and they watched videos of news, small news pieces from BBC about suffering in the world. There is enough suffering in the world. So we had hundreds of news segments of dying people, starving people, women crying because they lost their children in accidents and so on. And we scanned the brain of the participants when they were watching this very, very negative, strong material. And we asked them how much negative emotion you felt, how much stress, negative emotion, and how much positive emotion. And non-trained people, at the beginning, all reported very negative emotions when they saw this video. And it was going along with activation in a network which was known to process negative affect, stress, alarm network. It's like very big. So now we...
when you use the word negative and positive, what the basis?
The demarcation, what's the definition?
The definition of...
And also is when you mentioned wholesome, right? Wholesome
Yeah.
thoughts.
So I think there is a difference between Buddhist tradition and Western science, that we don't define emotions in terms of their function, whether they are adaptive, wholesome, or destructive, but according to the qualia.
Tanya, am I right in informing His Holiness the way in which modern psychological sciences distinguish between the two is when the actual emotion arises, how do you feel? If you feel good,
Exactly.
then it's positive. If you feel
Negative
and bad
Yes.
and unhappy, it's more on that spectrum are negative. So it's really kind of a phenomenologically defined.
Yes.
Am I right?
It's
And His Holiness says,
aversion. It's aversion, the feeling of aversion and liking.
Now, just to point out, I think this is going to be one of the most fruitful areas of dialogue between Western psychology and neuroscience and Buddhism, because I think that the wholesome-unwholesome distinction has not been tested in a serious way in Western science.
Yeah.
And I think that that is something that we can test. And it would lead to a very different organization of emotion, and I think it has many important implications.
And another...
Still, I believe, this is Kasoda, based on
It's a secular context.
So when we use the word Buddhism, then secular marta.
Right, so when you say Buddhism, then it has non-secular aspects.
But, yeah.
So that's why you see, I think at the beginning in Shyamasanganda,
네, so
Buddhist science,
Buddhist science long.
she needs to share the secular.
So because if we bring that aspect from the classical Buddhist sources that really pertain to exploration and understanding of the actual nature of reality, then it will fit nicely within this secular framework. So earlier His Holiness was saying that this distinguishing between positive and negative based on affect is actually suits nicely within the secular context.
Yes.
Simply, it's some kind of feel happy,
Right.
feel comfortable. That's
Positive.
since we want that, we appreciate that, so we call positive.
Positive.
Something, although I think some people, I think when develop, you see, anger, perhaps they get an anger and with some harsh word, I think the person may get some satisfaction. but this has a short term. Right?
네.
Long term, the constant sort of anger very bad for their health. So therefore, consider negative.
Yeah. But I think
Not
one of the
not talking about next life or not talking about nirvana or these things. So,
one of the crucial emotions, though, will be sadness, because sadness can sometimes play a, I think, beneficial role, and it may, in the moment, not be associated with happiness, but it may have some, I think, beneficial quality. But we can talk about this later. But anger is clear. Anger is clear.
sadness is the cancer study. I think according to Buddhism, Four Noble Truths, the first Noble Truth, you see, actually you see the some connection with sadness, right? But because there is alternative, third Noble Truth, and there is a way to achieve that fourth Noble Truth.
Yes.
Therefore, thinking reminds sadness is something fruitful. Otherwise, no use.
Exactly.
Okay.
And perhaps you could even now, in this model, say
Here, I think, as you mentioned, is to make distinction.
Distinction.
Empathy and compassion. Right? Sadness, so realize this is this sort of suffering. This is the cause of suffering. More deeper sort of thinking about that may not bring sadness. I think that more holistic. Now, for example, the Four Noble Truths. Once you see you have clear picture about third Noble Truth, and the proper way achieve that Four Noble Truth. Is it thinking more because of the suffering? You get more because of the will. Enthusiasm. And because of the deep down, there's some kind of tremendous courage, tremendous sort of
courage.
And I think some kind of very, very, very positive sort of mental sort of attitude, full of courage. So that I don't think sadness.
no sadness. Do you need to
Sadness
feel
doesn't
suffering?
kind of demoralize. That's sadness. Realize the suffering, and even you feel, but full of sort of determination, full of willpower. I don't think there is sadness. Oh, French expert. What do you say? What do you say? Do you agree? Oh, it does. Yes, sir.
And do you think that you need empathy for suffering first before developing compassion?
So it's
not common.
a slightly complicated issue, because in the Western conception of empathy, there seems to be a suggestion for the need for resonance. So, so it suggests that in order to have empathy, the person who is feeling compassion also needs to feel the other's pain.
Yes.
But perhaps I think someone physical pain, passing through physical painful experience. You see, there's no possible way, impossible. You see, to get your own physical pain. No.
You can.
But mentally, yes, very painful sort of feeling.
So mentally you feel the pain of the other, but not physical.
Oh, 저상가? pain said it can't actually develop.
So it's still
It's very.
it's a tricky.
It's
it's
very-
a difficult question.
It's very interesting. Perhaps I may add some neuroscience on pain. The pain, when we have a pain network,